Richard Hedarian to Aljazeera, political analyst and author of The Rise of Duterte, a populist revolt against elite democracy. Richard, the name recognition in this election, the name Duterte will still be around there. There's Marcos, there's Pacquiao. I mean, it's almost this, well, there is this dynastic quality to this election.
Well, I mean, this is one fundamental problem with the supposed democratic regime that replaced the Marcos dictatorship in 1986. There was no effort to bring back robust political parties. There was no effort to prevent the proliferation of political dynasties, which are making a mockery out of the Philippines' claim to being a democracy. I mean, for heaven's sake, between 70 to 90% of offices in the legislature are occupied by political dynasties. So for many ordinary Filipinos, they don't see real democracy. And that is precisely why authoritarian populist leaders like Duterte in 2016 and now Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. are doing so well, precisely because they're exploiting the people's disenchantment with the lack of genuine democracy.
So who, if you were a voter there and were looking for someone who is genuinely talking about breaking through all of that elitism, who is that candidate? Is there that candidate?
Well, you know, all the candidates are a mixed baggage in one way or another. It's just a question of magnitude, right? I mean, Manny Pacquiao, you know, he came from rags to riches, but he's now also building his own kind of a political dynasties. You know, his family members have been also involved in politics. Then, of course, in the case of Vice President Leni Robredo, they don't come up necessarily from a political dynasty, but their late husband, Jesse Robredo, was a major political figure. And of course, that helped her to become the kind of national figure she is today. But there are other candidates like Isko Moreno, the Manila mayor, who really came from the rags to riches, doesn't come from any political dynasties, and he's trying to provide an alternative. But the reality is that Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is garnering some sort of a prohibitive gain over all other candidates. He's cornering more than 50% of the total votes. This is unprecedented. No front runner has enjoyed this kind of edge this close to the election day.
Richard, if we strip away the names and the personalities, which is not easy in an election like this, but if we get rid of that and just think about the issues, what matters to Filipinos now? I am going to guess it's still the basics of employment, of access to food, to infrastructure, all these sorts of things, the things which are important to any person.
Well, absolutely. Surveys have been consistent that really gut issues are number one to average Filipinos, especially now amid the pandemic, after the economic damage that the pandemic wrought. Really, economic recovery has been at the center of the campaign messaging of all candidates. And all of them are saying once they come into power, they're going to make sure that economic recovery and transitioning into post-pandemic scenario is going to be their priority. But the reality is that this is also about a broader political zeitgeist. The surge of the Marcoses is nothing short of a counter-revolution to eviscerate essentially the legacy of the 1986 People Power Revolt. Should the Marcoses return to the presidential palace, the Philippines will never be the same again. For sure, they'll try to upend the constitution and instead create a new political order altogether. That is why this election is perhaps the most important election in Philippine history, at least for the past half a century.
Fascinating. It's going to be really interesting, isn't it? Thank you, Richard Hedarian. Great to talk to you.
Pleasure.